Are you confused as to what size brush you should be using for acrylic? From size 4 to 24, which one do you pick? Big versus small. Let's get started. Brushes come in many sizes and shapes. You can get a cat tongue, you can get a round, you can get square. Now, for the first few years of my business, I worked with square. I loved it. And then I was introduced to the oval, and I actually really became to love it because it has a nice point, and Frenches is what we were doing for years back in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so I've got two shapes here. That's the cat tongue. I actually really like the cat tongue because it does have sort of a wide area and the point. And I loved working with the square for years, but it doesn't have the point, which is what I really fell in love with. Which brings me to the oval shape, and it's become very popular for doing acrylic. And I think because it has the versatility to do all shapes and styles. So now we come down to size. You can get brushes, they're up to size 24. Look at the size of this one. Now, if I compare that to a size 8, see the size difference? And that's what brings us to this important conversation. There's a lot of artists that can do nails with these big brushes, but to me, it's not unlike if you're asked for a teaspoon of sugar in your recipe and you grab a cup to get that teaspoon. You can certainly gather a teaspoon's worth inside that cup, but you don't need the cup to do it, and it's not very accurate. So by having such a big brush, you potentially, most likely, will grab way too much monomer. Too much monomer makes it so that you cannot cure it if you don't have enough powder. And if you equal the powder to the amount of monomer that's in the brush, the bead will be giant, right? So essentially, you're only using, if you're using a big brush like this, you're only using the top part of the brush. But unfortunately, the bristles are meant to absorb the monomer, and they can absorb too much. So having a smaller brush allows you to maintain and keep the right bead. And the reason why having too much monomer on our nails is important is because it can lead to allergies. If we have uncured product on our fingers, when we file it, it gets on our hands and our skin, and we have too much uncured product on our skin all the time, and it can lead to allergies. Also, when you're using a big brush, when you're wiping away and you're patting and you're shaping and you're sculpting with your brush, you have much more of an opportunity to hit the skin, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So for those artists that are using a big brush and they've learned to control their liquid to powder, that's great. I'm not saying you can't do that, because some of those artists do it very well. But to start off and be expected, or you think you have to measure up to that, that's not where you have to go. And that's why I created a smaller brush. I've been using an oval 8 for most of my career. And I've tried the other ones, and I would work up to a size 10. So I can even use a 12 if I needed to, if I had to, right? But I still wouldn't use most of the brush. Anything beyond that really is something I'm not used to using, and I don't even want to attempt it because it's just holding too much monomer. So that's why I specifically designed an oval 8. I believe it is great for learning and the body of your career, all through your career. It's the perfect size brush. And let me show you that. And I will show you a comparison to that big 24 again. Now let me show you an 18. So this is an 8 and a 24. And let me show you an 18. This is in between. Just as a side note, when you're picking your brush, I will tell you, these wooden brushes are very nice and light, but if you get any monomer or acetone or anything like that on the stem of your brush, it can sort of eat away at the wood. That's why I do like the brushes that have a metal coating like that, so they don't get affected. Let me just give you a demonstration so I can show you the bead size between an 8 and a 24, okay? I'll do it on my thumb so you can see it. I have this darker color, so it'll be good to be able to see. Okay, so especially if you are learning and you're counting how long you're in your liquid and your powder, the size of brush will make a very big difference on the size of that bead. So if you're counting, let's say you dab a couple of times in the monomer and you hold for 3 to 5 seconds in the powder, that size bead will be very different for the size of brush that you have, because each brush will absorb differently. Okay, I'll show you on the towel first, actually. 3, 4, and that's the size of bead that I can get. And that's a pretty good size bead if you're even clear capping. Now with this one, I'm going to gather all my monomer. It's a big brush, so you do want to get the whole thing wet, but then you tap off because you don't want to have too much, just like you normally would. And then you go in and you hold 3, 4, 5, and then you take out, look at the size of bead in comparison. And why does that matter? It doesn't, but the bigger the bead, the more you're having to deal with and control, especially when you're first learning. This can be difficult. And that's why I'm suggesting if you're watching videos that they're using big beads, if you're trying to achieve that, that is really something tough to live up to. Those artists know how to work the acrylic, especially if they're have their liquid to powder ratio correct. They really worked how to get that giant bead. Sort of starting with 2 balls in the air when you're juggling and you add one, you add one, you add one. Start with smaller beads, and if you really want to get to a bigger bead, you can. So let me show you on my size of nail. So if I was wanting to clear cap this, I could go in, retrieve my bead, put that in, and I can manage this size bead quite nicely, and I can sculpt it and put it where I want, right? And even that will take practice. Now, if you're watching this, it's going to act a little bit differently because the nail surface is very smooth. But let me wipe that off. And then I'll show you with a big brush how different that can look. It's just taking too much at once. And here's this giant bead. Now look how big that bead is. It's almost too big for my finger. And if you're trying to sculpt that all over, it's also very fluffy. See, and you gotta try to maneuver that and get it all into the right places at the same time. That's a lot of bead to control. And see how much it's getting on my skin? And when you're first learning, this is going to be the problem. You're trying to corral that bead and sculpt it to where you want it. And you're also trying to learn the liquid to powder. So if it's runnier, it's going to go everywhere, right? So now you can start to shape it up. But you can see it does cover the whole thing, which is great, but that's something you'll want to be able to work up to. So I just suggest when you're first starting, I probably should get this off. I'm trying to do another video, so I don't want to have this all icky. So great for the artists that can do that, but it's certainly somewhere where you don't want to start your career, and it's certainly something you don't have to try to achieve. To each his own, eh? So you might ask, can you get a little bead with a big brush? Let's do that. So take as much monomer out of the bristles as you can. And we're just going to get a little bit, just on the very tip of it. And we're going to rest it in there. And that is a pretty small bead. And then you can place it on your finger. And now you just have to maneuver it around. And when it gets into the tighter areas, as you can see, when you get good at your brush, you can certainly do it. Here's the smaller brush. See how much easier it is to see? You can see the nail better. And it's just easier to manipulate and not hit the skin. That's one thing that we really want to do is we do it sometimes, but the goal is you don't want to, especially the better you get at it. So you can do it with a big brush. As you can see, I hit the skin there a little bit. It's just a bit of a different learning curve and a little bit harder, almost like brushing a baby's hair with a big adult brush. You don't need that much brush. Also, I do love a brush that has a cap so you can keep your bristles nice and soft in between appointments. I hope that helps you understand why the size of your brush is so important during an acrylic application. I'd love to hear your thoughts and I'll read them in the comments below. Thanks for joining me, you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.